Welcome to this week's episode of FIREside Chats. My name's Theresa Glinski. I'm a program officer here at the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, or FIRE, and it's my pleasure to be joined by my colleague Susan Kruth, one of our staff attorneys for the Stand Up for Speech Litigation Project, William Creeley, the Vice President of Legal and Public Advocacy, and Zachary Greenberg, who's our Justice Robert H. Jackson Legal Fellow. So today we're going to be talking about some of the topics that we're covering in our Spring 2018 Activism Toolkit, which is hosted by the FIRE Student Network. And in this toolkit, it gives opportunities for students to take action on campus. And the title or theme of this semester's toolkit is Let Them Speak. So we're going to start off by talking about the right to listen. So oftentimes when we're talking about free speech, freedom of speech gets the big topic when we're talking about freedom of expression, but the right to listen doesn't get as much love, I guess. So what is the right to listen? How would we describe that? Well,
yeah, I'll jump in here first. Thanks for having me. 2 consecutive weeks on FIREside Chats. I feel very good about that. I remember to wear a different colored shirt this time, so I'm already ahead of the game. Yeah, the right to listen, the right to hear, the right to receive information. As you say, Theresa, oftentimes we think about freedom of speech. That implies the speaker. Now hear this, here I am opening my big fat mouth. Everybody will naturally be interested. But one thing we forget about is the right of the audience, right? The right to show up and hear from somebody, whether you agree with them, whether you loathe them, whether you can't stand their ideas, or whether you are ready to subscribe to their newsletter, and to decide for yourself. So the First Amendment protects the both sides of that coin, as Justice Thurgood Marshall put it, both the right to talk and the right to hear. And you can't really have one effectively without the other. So yeah, they work in a continuum.
Yeah. And why is it important for the right to hear, for it to be protected on college campuses in particular? Why is that so important, Susan?
Yeah, well, college is supposed to be a place where you hear new ideas. And for a lot of students, it's going to be the first time that they're really surrounded by people with different upbringings and backgrounds and opinions about things. So especially at that time of their life, they have to have that opportunity to hear all sorts of new ideas. And of course, it goes along with the freedom for them to share their own ideas. But like Will said, it's 2 sides of the same coin.
And adding on to that, the point of a college education, of a liberal arts education, is to have students be challenged for their deepest beliefs and their deepest convictions. And I think if you go to college and you don't feel uncomfortable about some of the things that are being taught, you should get your money back. That's why you go to college, to expand your perspective and to have a deeper understanding of the world around you.
And when a speaker is censored, for instance, it's pretty clear that they're the ones being censored, but who is affected when the right to hear isn't being honored?
Well, I'll just jump in here. There's a couple of people, right? So first of all, it's the person supporters, right? People who want to come and see their ideological champion or mouthpiece or whomever. People who agree with that person, they are robbed of the chance to agree with them in public or to hear their latest thoughts on whatever is going on. But you're also robbing those people in the middle, right, who maybe haven't made up their mind. I'm thinking about controversial speakers like some of the folks, folks we saw being disinvited last semester or in recent years. If you don't know what you think about, say, Condoleezza Rice, to use an example of somebody who's been disinvited, maybe you think, well, the Bush administration was a long time ago. I'm not really sure what happened. Maybe I'll go check it out. Well, if you show up at that event and it's being shut down because somebody called in a bomb threat or because somebody has rushed the stage and grabbed the mic, you don't have the opportunity to make up your own mind for yourself. And that means that you don't have the opportunity to say, you know what, I agree with Condoleezza Rice, or I'm still not sold, or hey, I really wanted to ask her that question about her role in the Iraq War. I don't have the opportunity anymore. And so that also goes for the critics, too. It's not just the people who agree, not just the people who are unsure, but also the critics. If you disagree with somebody and you are feeling morally or intellectually or however compelled to go and challenge that person, if you don't have the opportunity to do so because the speech has just been canceled, because it's just been a kind of a blanket no platform movement and said we're not going to allow this person on our campus, you don't have the opportunity to expose their ideas to sunlight, to paraphrase Justice Louis Brandeis, right? You don't have the chance to challenge them and make them answer for what they've done that you found so objectionable in the first place. So I think everybody kind of loses out there. Although it's counterintuitive, right? There's a certain like emotional appeal, like let's censor this person. But the longer strategic aim, I think, for people who want to move the ball for their own ideas is to challenge those ideas they disagree with.
Yeah, I think with that middle group of people who hasn't made up their mind yet, it seems like a lot of times people either forget that they exist and can really be swayed either way by, especially by, you know, after lecture Q&A or things like that, or they assume that they're going to be persuaded by whatever they hear. And so if there's a controversial speaker who lots of people disagree with, they don't want that speaker to be heard because they assume that they might be persuasive. But I think that sometimes people forget about the possibility that someone who is on the fence will see that speaker and then be like, oh my God, this person is actually horrible. And I'm glad I saw this because now I know that I disagree with them and I know that I have to push back against this. And so remembering that possibility too is really important. And with that in mind, censorship can sometimes really hurt the people who, you know, want to be censoring, ironically.
Yeah, so it's not just about the people who want to attend the event. It's about people who are on the fence or might not even want to go and get persuaded one way or another.
Yeah, and I want to just jump on that point real quick. And the people who do want to go and who find the event canceled because of some kind of disruption or some kind of, as I say, no platforming attempt, they will only be more confirmed in their beliefs, right? I mean, ultimately, you want to persuade folks, if assuming this is the aim, ultimately you want to persuade folks that your views are the best and your view of the world is the most moral, most compassionate, smartest, whatever. If you censor whomever it is, whether it's Condoleezza Rice, Milo Yiannopoulos, whomever, provocateur of the day or the moment, their supporters are going to feel emboldened. They're going to be like, wow, this guy is really, or this woman is really onto something. This is the speech that is too dangerous for me to hear. You know, this really must be the truth if all these people are trying to shut them up. Far better to just ignore it or challenge it. And I do want to talk about ignoring later because I think that is a powerful strategy. It's just not giving folks oxygen, but we'll get to that in a minute.
Yeah. Later on we'll talk about tactics, but I guess starting now, what can students do to make sure that the right to listen is being honored on campus? What's the first step?
Well, I think that the most important step is being proactive. Make sure that you know what your school's policies are, and if they aren't good, if they allow for Hecklers veto or shutting down certain ideas, try to change those policies now, because it's going to be a lot easier to get administrators on board with a neutral speech protective policy if they're not actually thinking about, Richard Spencer or some other really controversial figure. It's going to be easier to get them to sort of agree to things when it's a little bit more abstract, which is a little bit, it's kind of sad that they can't actually always apply this in the moment, but as a strategy, that might be more effective. And on the administrator's side, they should be motivated to create clear policies before the controversy, because it's easier to defend if they're already in place. So that would be my recommendation, is just get things settled as soon as you can, basically.
I think it's like a disaster prep, have a plan,
exactly.
Have 2 gallons of water in your cupboard or whatever you need, or have walkie-talkies or something. So if things go nuts, you already know what you're going to do, right? So when the New York Times is calling you up and saying, we hear that Richard Spencer is coming to your campus, what do you do when white supremacist is coming? You already know, and you can say, students and faculty and everybody, we're sticking to our policy. This is what it is. Here's our counter programming. Here's whatever we want. Let's move forward.
Yeah.
It's also important to have a culture of free speech on campus. You can have all these great policies, but I think many students, for whatever reason, don't want to read the very long and boring student handbook that they give out during orientation. So I think to create this culture, it's important to seek out those you disagree with. For example, when I was in college, I went to the the College Democrats and College Republicans groups, even though I was a member of neither, just so I can hear them out to see what they have to say. And so it's about teaching students that, look, this is more about these cultural norms of hearing people out and not demonizing those who disagree with. That way, regardless of what the policies say, you can have a situation where you can avoid having a speaker disinvited.
But if you want to demonize them, right, you have a right to do so. I just want to be clear on that, right? So it's not just like, oh, we're going to take everything a little bit of the buffet. That takes a very, I think, mature or unique mindset. So I salute you for being able to do that. Some people don't want to do that, right? And for those folks, I don't want to say free speech requires you to hear out somebody that you don't want to hear out. I want to be clear, right? So if Spencer's coming, he offends your moral sensibilities, as he does a great many people for obvious reasons. You don't have to engage, right? You don't have to try and find the good in folks you disagree with. But what you should do, I think, strategically, again, is to allow them to hoist themselves by their own petard, right? And that maybe speaks to your free speech culture part. Maybe what all of us need to be reminded is that everybody has the right to speak their mind. So let's not focus on whether or not they have that right. Let's focus on the substance of it. And either you can reject it out of hand, you can have the counter protest outside, or you can ignore it. But when you get caught up in whether or not the person has access, I think that's exactly what folks, these provocateurs, are kind of relying on. They want to have that controversy. That's what moves the meter for them. So
yeah, but also making sure that students understand that there's a right to be heard as well before that big speech happens. And so. During a survey that we conducted in the fall, 56% of respondents said that they support disinviting a speaker. And what are disinvitations, and what does that mean for the campus communities that are involved with that?
Well, disinvitations are just when, because of outside pressure or, petitioning from students or some other potential audience that disagrees with a speaker, their invitation to speak at the school is rescinded. And it has all the bad ramifications that we just talked about. People are deprived of the opportunity to hear an idea, whether they disagree with it or agree with it or are not sure how they feel. And that whole potential for discussion and potentially for progress, however you define it, is just disappears. And then, usually there's a different kind of discussion that happens instead, which is all about, free speech and people's rights. And that discussion is important, but it shouldn't be supplanting every other substantive discussion that could be happening instead,
Now, FIRE also has a disinvitation database where it's been cataloging these disinvitations that were successful, the disinvitation attempts, and the Hecklers vetoes that have occurred on campus since 2000. What's the importance of knowing about these disinvitation attempts, and even for students when it's happening at their campus or at the University of Wisconsin? Why would it be important that they know that this is happening and what they can do about these types of things?
I think the most impactful part of our database is that it comes from all different sides. People from across the political spectrum have been disinviting speakers from across the political spectrum. And this is really interesting because a lot of people paint the left or the right as being bad for free speech or pro-free speech. But really the database shows that provocateurs of all stripes have been subject to this really abusive tactic.
Yeah, I like that point, Zach. I was about to say the same thing. When we were getting a lot of phone calls in the fall about Spencer coming to campus and the various litigation going on, one thing I was reminded of, back in 2008, 2009, after Barack Obama was elected president, there was a lot of attention on Bill Ayers, who is now an education professor of some real note, but back in the 60s and 70s had been a member of the Weather Underground and had lived as a fugitive for a while, and he got a fascinating book about it. Forget the name of it now, I'm blanking, but anyway, he's an interesting guy, and there had been a lot of attention about him, and because the Weather Underground engaged in domestic terrorism and set bombs, his appearances on campus for education events generated a lot of protest, oftentimes from law enforcement groups, and he was disinvited at the University of Nebraska, and the University of Nebraska cited some of the same concerns that we heard universities cite this past fall, distasteful views, or will generate a significant amount of protest, or have generated threats to the university, or there's going to be violence, et cetera. Kind of these amorphous safety concerns. And Ayers went to court and won. And we covered that case, and we applauded the result, to point out that these kind of vague concerns about order aren't enough to trump the First Amendment, right? If you disagree with Ayers, by all means protest him, just like if you disagree with Spencer, please protest him. But denying someone a platform is antithetical to our democratic values. So yeah, just this access, like what comes around goes around, right? It comes from all sides. When everybody is kind of like the term politically correct, which I don't like because everybody's got something that they don't want to hear, right? That's something that doesn't jive with their sense of politics. Same thing here, right? Everybody's got a speaker that they don't want to hear. I remember doing a Huffington Post Live thing a couple years ago. The topic of the day was Mumia Abu-Jamal, who is in federal prison, I think federal prison, for allegedly killing a Philadelphia police officer, and he's been on death row. He's been an anti-death row activist for some years. So when Mumia Abu-Jamal gets invited to do something, again, there's a significant substantial protest from law enforcement. The same thing happened when he's invited to give this speech. And so, you know, again, everybody's sensibilities are going to be offended sometime, right? And folks are going to say with real sincere passion, how could you invite that person? This person literally killed a police officer, you know, and has been convicted of it. How could you invite them? In the same way that folks have made passionate and subjectively sincere and powerful arguments about bringing Spencer to campus. Like, everybody's got something, is my point.
Absolutely.
Also, the database can be used as a tool for student groups because there's some certain patterns that emerge from these practices. Once one speaker is invited from one university, other universities jump on that and they say, look, he couldn't come here, now we shouldn't be allowed here. So it could be used to see what's coming by the student groups in the chess match that is student groups on campus.
Yeah, that's right. And like Ayers was had the same problem at a number of schools when he was doing talks. And you know, we've seen what's happened with Spencer and folks like that this semester. Yeah.
So in addition to just the disinvitation attempts where people try and have a speaker disinvited and the successful disinvitations, we have Hecklers veto. So can you describe, Zach, what are Hecklers vetoes and why that's problematic for free speech?
Sure. It is an attempt to materially disrupt a speech using violence or other tactics and prevent that speaker from actually speaking. It's also when the university cancels a speech preemptively due to the anticipated reaction of that speech by the audience. And that's a pretty serious problem because on a college campus, students should not be using disruptive tactics or violence, God forbid, to prevent a speaker from exercising their free speech rights.
Yeah. And when a speech is occurring, what might a heckler's veto look like?
Well, the classic example is bottle throwers throwing glass bottles at the speakers. That's a big one. But a lot of the examples we see nowadays are chants using other sound amplification techniques to drown out the speaker so other people can't hear what they're saying. And that's incredibly problematic.
Yeah. And instead of a heckler's veto, you know, these students are at the speech itself, so they're engaged. What can a student do who disagrees with the speaker but wants to express their discontent maybe with those opinions without actually shutting down the speech or heckling them?
There's lots of ways that you can add your own opinion to the conversation without detracting from someone else's ability to share their opinion too. There's all sorts of silent protests you can do, whether that's, you know, holding up signs or just, you know, being there wearing a pin or, you know, whatever. You can also respond either before or after the fact. Maybe you publish an op-ed, maybe you speak up during the Q&A session, but it's important to just remember the distinction between, again, adding your opinion to the ones that are available for everyone to hear and replacing someone else's opportunity to speak with your own voice.
Yeah, I like that. And to the point about silent protest, we got a lot of phone calls last spring after Vice President Mike Pence spoke at University of Notre Dame, and there was some media attention to the fact that a lot of Notre Dame students got up and walked out while he was speaking. And folks called us up and said, "You're going to condemn this, right?" And I remember I was on the phone and I thought, no, I'm not. It did not disrupt the speech. The speech went on. It's a form of silent protest, respects the right to listen, the right to hear that we've been talking about. Okay. And for the record, back to our previous point about how things come around and go around, the year prior, there have been big protests of then Vice President Joe Biden. So comes around, right?
Right, yeah. Yeah, so in addition to disinvitations, the right to listen, oftentimes students are looking for ideas to respond to speakers with which they disagree. Will, you mentioned that it's okay if you disagree with a speaker and you don't have to just be silent in those situations. You wrote an op-ed in October titled How to Respond to Richard Spencer. What was the motivation behind writing that op-ed, and if you could discuss some of the things that you wrote about in it?
Yeah, well, all of us, I think, go to campuses all the time. And so the three of you know, just like I know, that the question you oftentimes get is, okay, I hate Richard Spencer. Like, what can I do, right? If I can't, jump up, grab the mic and say, this guy's an evil fascist and end the speech, what's left, Well, lots of things, right? And we've talked about some of them, right? Silent protest, walking out on folks, holding a counter protest, holding a counter speech, counter programming in some way, op-eds, insightful, incisive questions, let the person expose themselves for who they are. And I think there's a real value to that. So I just wanted to provide some practical advice because as a free speech advocate, you get asked a lot of times to parse, well, surely this is beyond the pale, right? Or what can we do in light of this? And I wanted to remind people that free speech doesn't just empower the Richard Spencers of the world, it empowers people who disagree with Richard Spencer, who want to call Richard Spencer to the mat and say those ideas are no good. And one of the things I point out in the piece is that if you do stand up and you do have the counter protest, you will see how many people really agree with you as opposed to them. There's this story that I remember being told by an Ole Miss administrator, an old dean by the great name of Sparky Reardon, back when I first started FIRE, and he was telling me on the phone in this great Southern accent about the Ole Miss. I think they had changed something about their football presentation, like whether they were going to stop playing Dixie or something like that. And the Klan called up Reardon and said, we're going to come to your campus and we're going to protest what you've done with the Ole Miss fight song. And Reardon said, okay. And instead of trying to ban the Klan, which is probably exactly what they want in terms of headlines and all the rest of it, he had put out notice that the Klan would be there, that the peace would be kept. There'd be no violence, but the peace would be kept. And he invited people who disagree with them to come out and say, I disagree with them. And the sheer numbers spoke for themselves, right? You see who stands with you in that kind of situation. And the power of counter speech, I think, is really well illustrated there. So I just want to provide people with some things so they don't feel powerless, right? So you don't feel like, man, free speech is this terrible bargain that just means that people I hate get to talk all the time. It's not like that.
Yeah.
And most speakers also have a Q&A period after they talk where students can come up and ask them any question they want. And sometimes that's more enjoyable than the speech itself. I remember one time I was listening to a speech up at Syracuse and some student comes out with the entirety of the New York State Constitution, reading the Constitution to the speaker. And it was really funny because I'm like, wow, I listen to that every day. Someone reading the Constitution to the speaker. And it was a great part of the speech, and I really enjoyed it. Everyone benefited from it, I hope.
So the last question, I guess it's a hypothetical rather. If a student's walking on campus, they see a flyer for a speaker and they recognize their work, they say, I disagree with them, but they don't know how to grapple with it. Then they go to class, students are talking about, we're gonna shut down the speech, they don't deserve to be on campus. Maybe we can go around and everybody can give one piece of advice for how to proceed from that moment, because it's a tough thing to do when your peers especially are calling for a disinvitation. So, Will, can we start off with?
Yeah, I would make a strategic argument about political power. I would say that if someone is kind of feeding on the energy and attention of being the speaker that's too dangerous for campus, giving them that protest that silences them is exactly what they want, right? Protest somewhere else, protest in a way that makes clear your displeasure but does not shut them up. Like, let them say their stupid thing and attack that stupid thing. Don't attack their right to say the stupid thing. And if I may, if you'll indulge me, I brought a quote from a really excellent speech that I found very persuasive by a guy named Nathan Robinson, who's the editor of Current Affairs. He gave this speech at the University of Connecticut recently as a counter-event to a Ben Shapiro appearance. He's on the left, disagrees with Shapiro, but I thought this was really a powerful argument. I'm just going to quote here. There's a pragmatic component here where I think it's strategically prudent to allow these people to speak and then counter their speech and do so as effectively as possible. And that may even sometimes involve a willingness to debate people. We may think that certain things shouldn't be up for debate, but in the society we live in, they unfortunately still are up for debate in practice because so many people, including the President of the United States, still disagree. And just as if we were living in the early 19th century, it would be our job to evangelize for the cause of anti-slavery and muster our most vigorous and powerful moral arguments against it, today is it our job to take on bad ideas about race, gender, war, and economics. Here's the crucial part. We don't necessarily legitimize ideas by debating them as long as we make clear in the process that we do not find those ideas legitimate and we're only discussing them as a means toward the end of getting rid of them. Point is, he's talking about persuading people, right? And if you shut down somebody, you are emboldening their followers and you are losing folks in the middle and you're not making your argument, right? Don't make the argument on whether or not they can speak. Make the argument about why you disagree with what they say.
All right. Thanks, Susan.
Yeah, this is sort of going along with that, but I always try to remind students how powerful they can be and how persuasive they can be. And I think it's really interesting that there are a lot of students who have, faith in their power to censor, and they recognize that they can be powerful in that way, but they seem to recognize less that they can be powerful also with their words and also, getting into the nitty-gritty and having that discussion. And so just reminding students and even, faculty that they can actually make a difference this other way besides censorship if they put all that same energy into doing that.
Yeah, the power to persuade.
Yes.
What about you, Zach?
Yeah, I would invoke John Stuart Mill, that he who knows only his own side knows nothing at all, and that the best way to counter the arguments is to understand them, to know what they're saying, to really understand what they're trying to do, and even how horrendous it may be. I mean, all the best debaters, all the intellectuals that have always destroyed their adversaries in the arena, the Christopher Hitchenses, the Ben Franklins, the Patrick Henrys, they've always known their side almost as well as the other side. And by looking at these speakers, by allowing them to speak, by having the flyers up, they can learn something, hopefully a lot, from their adversaries.
Yeah, the last point on that, totally agree. John Rausch, a gay rights activist, I quote him in the New York Times piece. I love this quote. He says, as the gay rights activist Jonathan Rausch said of one gay rights opponent, the more he talks and the more we talk, the better we sound, right? So a little bit of confidence in one's own position can go a long way.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. That wraps up this week's episode of Fireside Chats. For students who are interested in taking part of the activism toolkit, Let Them Speak, it's launching on February 16th, but the best way to know about it is by joining the FIRE Student Network. If you go to thefire.org/student network, you can sign up. It takes no time at all, and you get access to tons of resources and opportunities like conferences, events, and that's the best way to arm yourself to be able to counter speech that you disagree with and assert your rights. So thanks for joining us.